On this Monday night, back to school, but not back to normal. A new reality means new rules for some young Quebec students.
We have hand washing stations.
The plan getting an A from some parents and an F from others. Some Ontario stores reopen their doors.
We're just really excited, honestly.
But it's not business as usual. Contact tracing, why it's key to safely getting back to business.
Your employer is paying for your time. They are entitled to have information.
But privacy concerns persist. And politics and business, the balancing act, as the federal government announces a new lifeline for big companies.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with a dilemma playing out across the country, how to safely begin easing the restrictions we're all living with. Quebec and Ontario both made moves today to inch back to a new normal, even though Quebec has the most cases and the most deaths in Canada. Primary schools and daycares reopened in Quebec today, though only outside Montreal. Attendance is not mandatory and strict physical distancing rules are in place. Montreal is still shut down. It remains the epicenter of Canada's COVID-19 outbreak. Of the 85 new deaths reported in Quebec today, 82 were in the Montreal area. Premier François Legault calls the situation in that city very fragile and says he will push the planned date of reopening there beyond May 25th if necessary. The Prime Minister was asked today whether he thinks some provinces are moving too fast.
That the sacrifices we've all made for the past 2 months could all go up in smoke if we move too quickly on reopening or if a given jurisdiction makes the wrong decisions. That's why being cautious and gradual and vigilant is essential.
In Ontario, thousands of employees went back to work today. We'll get to that in just a moment. But we begin in Quebec and Mike Armstrong on how many parents were willing to send their kids back to class.
Principal Melanie Primo was on the sidewalk to welcome students back, but the buses that pulled up were almost empty. Only 3 kids on this one and only 3 on this one as well. Parents had been asked to register if their kids would be returning, so Primo says she knew what to expect and knew it wouldn't be many.
35, I would say 33 as of now, out of 170.
Those low numbers at Howick Elementary are fairly typical, according to the school board. It had 6 schools reopen Monday with about 20% attendance. Health officials have said it's safe, but even parents who did drop off their children were nervous.
You have to weigh it all. It's a personal choice, so it's hard. It's really hard to decide.
Such a beautiful classroom.
The school put out a video to reassure parents and students last week. It outlined what to expect in terms of precautions: hand sanitizer, staggered recess, physical distancing, and a new addition to the school day every 2 hours.
A bell or announcement will go over the intercom, and in intervals, everybody will wash their hands a few times through the day.
Now, attendance in some areas was higher. Quebec City saw about 2/3 of kids return. But schools in the Montreal region are still closed. They're not supposed to reopen until May 25th, and there's pushback. The city is the worst hit area in the country. Critics question whether it's too early to send kids back. The premier insists he's not rushing anything.
We still have 2 weeks in front of us, and if the situation is not getting better in the next 2 weeks, we'll postpone.
The province is going to watch the schools that reopen very closely, monitoring for COVID-19 outbreaks. But they're also going to watch how children not in school are doing and the mental health impact that might be having. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
We are tracking case numbers closely tonight as Canada approaches more pandemic milestones. The number of confirmed cases in this country is now nearly 70,000. Nearly 5,000 people have died. There are some positive signs in the numbers, though. More than 40% of those who have tested positive in Canada have recovered. And daily case numbers are trending downward in most parts of the country. A number of provinces had no new cases today, while in Ontario there were 308 new cases. That does represent a slowdown, though, over the past few weeks. And today, thousands of people in Ontario went back to work as some retail stores were allowed to reopen. Eric Sorensen explains the strategy in that province and the pitfalls that lie ahead.
Retailers across Ontario with street access have been allowed to reopen. Among them, the Common People Shop, a small general store in Toronto.
We're just really excited, honestly, to be able to see some of our regulars and see some of the new people who may have heard about our business.
They join garden centres and bigger businesses already open. Provincial and other parks have also opened ahead of schedule. All a welcome sight after 8 weeks of closures.
It's a good thing. It's showing us that all the work that we've done with social distancing is paying off, and it's good for our mental health to see that we're moving in the right direction.
The Premier hopes it's the right direction.
And with strict public health measures in place, today, thousands of people are going back to work. Thousands of people are earning a paycheck again.
Small business leaders are pleased to see more options for Canadians.
It hasn't made sense to us that we send all of our consumers to the same big box stores rather than spreading them out over the thousands of tiny companies that are lucky to see maybe 10 or 20 customers in a day.
Still, the economic lockdown required unprecedented government spending. Ontario's Financial Accountability Office forecasts the provincial deficit will grow from about $10 billion to $41 billion for the next year, and reopening only gradually could see the deficit deepen further.
Even more fiscal stimulus will be required. So even with the big numbers that we have today, I suspect that we still aren't done hearing about new programs to help stimulate a recovery.
Meantime, there is a steady improvement in the COVID-19 picture in Ontario. There's a lag time in counting, but Monday's 308 new cases shows a promising trend of declining numbers in the province. Health officials point out that a long-term lockdown wouldn't be healthy either.
We need to get life starting to go back to normal, but obviously this is going to result in some increase in the number of cases, and we have to be ready for that. But it's important to note that that is expected.
Restrictions are being eased, but it's also clear the economy is not stampeding towards business as usual. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Even when the curve completely flattens, it doesn't mean the virus has vanished. So returning to work and school will require constant vigilance. If there's an outbreak, it will have to be contained immediately. And that means tracing all the people anyone who tests positive has come into contact with. Companies are busy deploying a wide range of technologies and protective measures to help keep their staff and customers safe. But at what cost? Jeff Semple reports.
For the first time in weeks, this Toronto business is back in bloom. Ontario garden centres are now allowed to open their doors to the public, but when employees arrived, they barely recognized it.
It is extraordinarily different.
Besides keeping their distance, staff are required to wear protective equipment. And some companies are even adding surveillance. This auto plant opened its doors to workers for the first time in nearly 2 months. They're now scanned by thermal imaging cameras, taking their temperature before they're allowed in.
Even in the break areas, we've provided separation and barriers.
But what if an employee tests positive for COVID-19? Turns out there's an app for that. Private companies and governments in more than 25 countries have now deployed these contact tracing smartphone apps. They use a phone's GPS to track a person's location. So for example, if a coworker were to test positive for COVID-19, the company could retrace their steps and alert anyone who they might have had contact with.
It's important to kind of note that all of this remains anonymous.
This Vancouver app developer says his software also helps companies enforce physical distancing.
Let's say, for example, best practices is you're only allowed to have one person in a truck at a time on a construction site. And we sense that there are 2 people in the truck. We might send a notification.
But these location tracking COVID-19 apps are raising alarm bells.
If you start collecting geolocation data, you're going to lose a lot of faith in this and trust, because that can then be linked to personal identifiers.
Ontario's former privacy commissioner notes that Apple and Google are teaming up on a solution to support contact tracing with Bluetooth technology instead of GPS to better protect personal data. But while governments must persuade their citizens to use the software, employers don't need to ask.
Employers are allowed to know where their employees are and what their employees are doing because the employer is the one paying for the employee's time.
Health experts say these protective measures, including contact tracing, are critical if the country is to avoid a second wave and turn over a new leaf. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
A second Cargill meat processing plant is shut down in Canada, this one near Montreal. 64 employees tested positive for COVID-19. A week ago, Cargill reopened its plant in High River, Alberta, which had the largest outbreak in the country. More than 900 workers there tested positive, and there's pressure on the American-owned company to explain why workers aren't being kept safe. Heather Yourex-West explains.
A month after an outbreak among hundreds of workers at Cargill's High River meat processing plant, the company is facing another outbreak and another shutdown.
The plant is about to close temporarily because, it's a preventive measure. We want to test all the employees.
The Chambly facility is the third Cargill-owned plant that we know of to be impacted by COVID-19. Its High River, Alberta facility closed in mid-April after an outbreak there made more than 900 workers sick. 2 workers have now died. There has also been an outbreak in a facility in Fort Morgan, Colorado. At least 56 workers have tested positive. 1 person has died. But that plant has never closed. The decision to close the Chambly, Quebec plant came after 64 workers tested positive.
I would say that right now, Cargill wouldn't be on top of my list of companies that have managed COVID very well.
Cargill has faced criticism for failing to close the High River plant sooner before the outbreak there grew to become one of the largest in North America. An Alberta Occupational Health and Safety report also found the company excluded the union from an investigation into how the virus was allowed to spread. The company has been given more time to complete its investigation. But the Quebec facility is closing now, before a few dozen cases can become 100 or more.
The company will eventually be able to resume its activities after a certain period of confinement for those employees.
In a statement to Global News, Cargill says it's continually changing and improving how it responds to outbreaks in order to protect employees. Anyone required to take time off to isolate will be given up to 80 hours paid leave and will not be allowed back at work until they're symptom-free. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
The federal government is offering a new package to support big businesses struggling to survive. It's not described as a bailout. It's an emergency financing plan for companies and nonprofit organizations with annual revenue of $300 million or more. There are exceptions. Banks are not eligible, for example, nor are companies that pay their executives excessive salaries. But a whole range of companies could be eligible, from airlines to retailers to the oil and gas sector. There are some strings attached, strings that are as much about politics as business. Our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, is here to explain. David.
That's right. It's called the Large Enterprise Emergency Finance Facility, LEEFF, LEAF. They've been working on it for a couple of weeks, and all the while, there's been a battle inside the Liberal caucus as to whether or not to help out the oil and gas sector.
Some, led by Heritage Minister and Quebec MP Stephen Guilbeault, have argued it's time to let the fossil fuel industry die. But Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and Finance Minister Bill Morneau have led the fight in Cabinet to provide more help for the energy sector. So with the LEAF, oil and gas firms will be able to access federal financing. That's important to Freeland and Morneau, but those firms will have to demonstrate commitment to some environment and climate change goals. And that's important to Guilbeault and his camp. And all corporations getting LEAF funding will also have to agree to restrictions on executive compensation, forego dividends and share buybacks, and agree to honor collective agreements and pensions.
Now, those conditions are important as well to the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. And remember, this is a Liberal minority government, that its survival is going to depend on the help of a third party, Donna.
David, there's a lot of detail still to come. What's the early reaction, though, from businesses? Is there a willingness to take up this offer?
Well, the early reaction from corporate Canada is, okay, good start, but there's definitely more details needed, and there's going to be a transparency issue. Will taxpayers get to know the details of each loan arrangement with each firm? And all those firms, well, they're worried that those details are going to be disclosed. So that is going to be a barrier to take up, Donna.
All right, David Aiken in Ottawa, thanks. Now to Nova Scotia. The RCMP intend to conduct what they call a psychological autopsy on the gunman who killed 22 people. It will examine his past behavior and interactions with others. Police have spoken with more than 500 witnesses already. They're looking to speak with anyone who may have had past conflict with the gunman. Among the other details released today, RCMP say he had 4 firearms when he fled the town of Portapic, where the rampage began the night of April 18th. 2 were semi-automatic rifles and 2 were semi-automatic handguns. The RCMP did not release the make or the caliber. One of the guns was traced to Canada. The other 3 came from the United States. Investigators have also identified the business that produced the decals the gunman used to make his car look like a real RCMP cruiser. The decals, they say, were not made with the permission of the business owner. The gunman drove that replica police car for much of the 14-hour rampage and wore a real RCMP uniform. 22 people were killed, including RCMP Constable Heidi Stevenson. There was a somber procession along Nova Scotia's Highway of Heroes today. The body of one of 6 Canadian Armed Forces members killed in a helicopter crash last month was brought home. 23-year-old Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra was a marine systems engineer on HMCS Fredericton. All 6 on board the Cyclone helicopter were killed when it went down in the Ionian Sea off the coast of Greece on April 29th. The remains of only 2 have been found. The cause of the crash is under investigation. Stopping the spread in the West Wing. Coming up, what's being done to protect the American president's inner circle. Plus, South Korea's cluster of new cases after attempting to reopen. At the White House in Washington, COVID-19 is now hitting close to home. 2 staffers have tested positive, and several people on the coronavirus task force are now self-isolating. As Jackson Prosco reports, if the virus can reach one of the most secure buildings in the world, what does it mean for the rest of the country?
All the security in the world couldn't stop COVID-19 from penetrating the White House, potentially exposing the president and vice president.
It can happen. It's the hidden enemy. Remember that. It's the hidden enemy. So things happen.
Trump and his staff are given daily coronavirus tests. After the vice president's press secretary and the president's personal valet tested positive, there was a rush to trace anyone the 2 people had contact with.
Testing is important to quickly detect an outbreak and to contain an outbreak.
Members of the coronavirus task force, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, went into a modified quarantine as a precaution. The vice president declined to isolate. But rapid testing and tracing is largely unavailable to most Americans. Last week, the president also suggested it isn't needed.
This is why the whole concept of tests aren't necessarily great.
In an admission of vulnerability, the White House is now asking staff other than the president to wear face masks, muddling the message as Trump insists the virus is under control and states should reopen.
I think it points to the fact that all businesses need to be careful. And by the way, they need updated guidance from our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to ensure that they create a workplace that is as safe as possible.
Polls show most Americans were already worried about the risks of reopening too quickly. If the virus can spread here, it can spread anywhere. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Ahead, a dreadful feeling of deja vu. The coronavirus reemerges in Wuhan.
You're watching Global National.
There are new cases of COVID-19 reported in Wuhan, China, the first since lifting the 10-week lockdown there. 5 new cases were recorded in Wuhan. All of them live in the same residential compound, and they were asymptomatic, meaning they tested positive for the virus, but were not exhibiting any clinical symptoms like cough or fever. Health authorities have warned that as countries emerge from strict lockdowns, a rise in infections like this is likely. South Korea fears it could be on the cusp of a second wave. It has scrapped plans to reopen schools this week after a cluster of new cases linked to the capital's nightclub district. 85 recent cases are connected to bars and nightclubs popular with the LGBTQ community in Seoul, and all are linked to one man who is bar hopping. Authorities are contact tracing thousands of people who may have been to those bars and clubs. But there's been some reluctance to that. Some people in the gay community prefer anonymity and fear a backlash from South Korea's relatively conservative society. And in Germany, cases are rising just as lockdown measures there are easing. Germany recorded 357 new cases today, bringing the total number in that country to nearly 170,000. Gyms did reopen over the weekend, and places like restaurants, museums, and shopping malls reopened last week. Physical distancing measures are still in place, but the reproduction rate for the virus in Germany shows that it is now spreading exponentially. Next, Serenity Now, remembering a man who made us all laugh.
Who's saying you want a piece of me?
I could drop you like a bag of dirt.
You want a piece of me? You got it!
He was a TV dad like no other. Comedian Jerry Stiller has passed away after a career going back more than 6 decades. He was best known for his role on Seinfeld as George Costanza's father, Frank, a role that made him the father of Festivus.
And at the Festivus dinner, you gather your family around and tell them all the ways they have disappointed you over the past year.
And is there a tree?
No, instead there's a pole. Requires no decoration. I find tinsel distracting.
Stiller spent 9 years on the popular TV show The King of Queens. His last acting credit was in 2016, alongside his son Ben Stiller in the sequel to the hit movie Zoolander. Jerry Stiller was 92. His family says he died of natural causes. And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. This is National Nursing Week, and we leave you tonight with a tribute to nurses and other essential workers. In Paris, the base of the Eiffel Tower lit up with portraits of frontline workers, from doctors and nurses to shop workers and teachers who have kept working while others stayed home. The message is simple. Thankfully, you were there. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.